She knew, even with her eyes covered, even after years of waiting, even when everyone doubted, she knew. Her trembling fingers touched the man's face, and before anyone could say a word, she whispered a name, and in that moment, time stopped. Now, let's go back to the beginning of this story. Part 1. The long wait. Margaret never gave up. People told her over and over that it was better to move on, that war changed men, that maybe he was never coming back. But every morning, at exactly 5:30, she would pull her rocking chair onto the porch, look down the empty road, and wait. Her eyes never failed her. Even at 78, even after so many tears, she saw clearer than anyone in town. But no one understood. "Grandma, you need to stop this." "Stop what?" "Waiting." Margaret just smiled. They didn't know anything. She knew. She knew because mothers always know. Because a woman who has spent a lifetime recognizing her son by his scent, by the sound of his breathing, by the way his footsteps echo on the floor, never forgets. She knew because every night, before falling asleep, she felt her heart restless, as if something was about to happen. And that morning, before the sun even rose, she knew. She took her chair to the porch, pulled the shawl over her shoulders, looked down the empty road, and waited. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, a plane landed. A group of soldiers stepped off the ramp, carrying their bags, exhausted but with a different light in their eyes. Among them, one man took a deep breath. He reached into his jacket pocket. Inside, carefully folded, was the last letter he had received. "Son, I'm waiting for you, and I know you're waiting for me too. Come home soon. Love, Mom." He closed his eyes for a moment. It was time to go home. And now, what will happen when he arrives? In the next chapters, a secret will be revealed. Someone has planned a surprise, and Margaret, the woman everyone believed couldn't see anymore, will prove that she always saw everything. The well-kept secret. Margaret sat on the porch, rocking gently in her chair. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth after the night's rain. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and gazed down the road. It was still empty, just as it had been every day for the past 3 years. But today felt different. She could sense it deep in her bones. Something was coming. Inside the house, Emily and Rachel were in the kitchen, whispering. They had been planning something for weeks now, sneaking around, making calls when they thought she wasn't listening. They assumed that, just because her eyesight had faded with time, she wouldn't notice. They were wrong. "I don't know how we're going to pull this off without her figuring it out," Rachel murmured, glancing toward the porch. "We have to. This has to be perfect." Emily's voice was firm, but there was excitement in her tone. "He'll be here in a few hours. She can't know yet." Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You think she suspects anything? I mean, she always seems to know things. But no, I don't think she has any idea." Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. Oh, but she knew. She had heard them whispering in the evenings. She had noticed the way Emily's voice trembled with anticipation whenever she picked up the phone. She had felt the energy shift in the house, as if something big was about to happen. She may have lost some of her sight, but she wasn't blind. Something was happening, and she was ready. Meanwhile, Nathan leaned his head against the cold bus window, watching as the countryside blurred past him. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that always reminded him of home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter again. The edges were soft and worn from how many times he had unfolded it, read it, and traced his mother's handwriting with his fingers. "Son, I'm waiting for you." The words had kept him going through the darkest nights. The sound of gunfire, the weight of exhaustion, the endless waiting. But now it was over. After 3 years of deployment, he was finally on his way back. His stomach twisted at the thought. What if everything had changed? What if he had changed too much? He exhaled slowly. No. If there was one thing in this world he could count on, it was her. She was waiting for him. And soon, she would know he was home. Back at the house, Rachel peeked out the window. "The bus should be here in about 2 hours. We need to set everything up before that." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath. "This is going to be the best surprise of her life." Margaret rocked in her chair. Listening, she smiled. "Oh, my dear girls, I already know. The touch of love." The house was unusually busy. Emily and Rachel rushed back and forth, arranging flowers, setting up the dining room, checking their phones every few minutes. The air buzzed with nervous energy, but Margaret remained still in her chair on the porch, hands folded neatly in her lap. She could hear everything, the hurried whispers, the sound of furniture being moved, the crinkle of wrapping paper as someone tied a ribbon around a gift. What if she gets suspicious? Rachel asked, peeking through the curtains. She won't, Emily's voice was confident. But Margaret could tell she wasn't so sure. She has no idea what's coming. Margaret smiled to herself. If only they knew. For weeks, she had sensed something shifting in the air. A mother knows, and now, every instinct in her body told her he was close. She closed her eyes, feeling the breeze on her skin. Then, suddenly, a car door slammed shut. Margaret's heart skipped. The front door swung open as Rachel rushed onto the porch. "Grandma, come inside for a moment. We need you." Margaret exhaled, steadying herself. "What for?" "It's a surprise. Just trust me." Margaret hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, she slowly stood, gripping the armrests of the chair for support. Rachel gently took her arm and led her inside. The moment she stepped into the living room, she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The room was filled with warmth, something deep and unspoken hanging in the air. Then, Emily approached her, carefully holding something in her hands, a black silk blindfold. "Grandma, we want to give you a special surprise, but you have to trust us, okay?" Margaret raised an eyebrow but allowed them to tie the fabric around her eyes. "You girls are acting strange today." Rachel swallowed hard, trying to suppress a nervous laugh. "Just wait, you'll see. Or, rather, you'll feel." At that moment, Nathan stood just outside the door. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Coming home, standing in this exact spot, hearing his mother's voice through the walls. Now that he was here, his hands were shaking. He wiped his palms on his jeans, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The room fell silent. Margaret, still blindfolded, felt it instantly. A presence, a shift in the air. Her lips parted slightly, as if her body had recognized him before her mind could. Nathan took a careful step forward, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floor. Rachel and Emily were frozen, eyes darting between them. Their breath held. Nathan knelt down in front of her, and then, gently, carefully, he took her hands in his. Margaret gasped softly. Her fingers, frail but steady, instinctively traced his palms, moved up to his wrists, over the fabric of his jacket. She inhaled sharply. Then, her fingertips reached his face. The sharp line of his jaw, the stubble on his chin, the shape of his nose, his cheekbones. Her hands trembled as they moved over his skin, as if mapping out something long lost but never forgotten. Nathan shut his eyes as her fingers rested on his cheeks. Then, a whisper, a single word, so soft, so certain. "Nathan." A choked sound escaped him. Margaret let out a trembling breath, her fingers pressing against his face as if afraid he would disappear. Then, suddenly, the blindfold slipped from her eyes. Nathan's face came into focus, and in that moment, time stood still. The uncontrollable emotion. Margaret blinked. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't speak. She simply stared. Nathan was right there, his face just inches from hers. The boy she had raised, the man she had prayed for, the son she had feared she might never see again. But he was here, right here. Her hands were still on his face, trembling, fingertips tracing the familiar features she had memorized years ago. His hair was shorter, his jaw was sharper. His eyes, once full of youth, now carried the weight of things she could not begin to imagine. But it was him. It was her Nathan. A shaky breath left her lips. "It's you." Nathan's throat was tight. He hadn't expected her to recognize him so fast. He thought she would need more time, that she might hesitate. But no. She had known the second she touched him. Tears blurred her vision, and she gripped his face tighter, as if afraid he might vanish. "My boy, you came home." Nathan swallowed hard. He had spent years in a world where emotions had to be buried deep, where survival meant keeping your heart locked away. But now, sitting in front of his mother, feeling the warmth of her hands on his face, he couldn't hold it in anymore. His eyes burned, His breath hitched, and before he could stop it, a single tear slipped down his cheek. Margaret saw it. She felt it. And then she broke. A sob tore through her chest, raw and deep, and she pulled him against her, holding him as tight as her frail arms allowed. Nathan clung to her just as fiercely, his head resting against her shoulder, his body shaking. I thought I lost you. I know, Mom, I know." He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of her. Home, warmth, safety. The room was silent except for the sound of their breathing, the quiet sobs, the heartbeat of a mother and son finally reunited. Rachel and Emily stood frozen, their hands pressed to their mouths, tears streaming down their faces. They had imagined this moment, hoped for it, dreamed about it, but nothing could have prepared them for how powerful it truly was. After what felt like eternity, Margaret pulled back just enough to cup his face again. Her thumb brushed away his tear, just like she used to do when he was a little boy. "Let me look at you." Nathan let out a soft, shaky laugh. "You're already looking at me, Mom." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I know. I can't believe it. You're really here." Nathan nodded, blinking rapidly, trying to regain control of himself. "I told you I'd come back." She let out a breathless chuckle. "I never doubted you, not for a second." Nathan let out a small, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. Everyone else did. Everyone kept saying maybe I wouldn't make it, that you should stop waiting. Margaret's expression softened. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. "They don't know a mother's heart." Nathan swallowed the lump in his throat. He thought about the nights overseas when he lay awake, wondering if he'd ever come home, the moments of fear, of exhaustion, of loneliness. And yet, through it all, he had held on to one thing, one belief, that she was waiting, that no matter what happened, she would be there, and she was. Nathan took a deep, shaky breath. "I missed you so much." Margaret smiled, her hands never leaving his. "I know, my boy, but you're home now, and I'm never letting you go again." And with that, she pulled him into her arms once more, holding on for dear life, because no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much had changed, a mother never stops knowing her child, and love never fades. Memories of a mother's heart. Nathan sat on the old couch in the living room, still holding his mother's hands. His palms were calloused, roughened by years of war and survival, but hers were soft, thin and delicate, yet unshaken. The hands that had raised him, the hands that had never stopped waiting. Margaret hadn't let go of him since he walked through that door. She held his hands, as if afraid he would disappear again. She wasn't wrong. For 3 years, Nathan had lived in a world where nothing was certain. One moment, you were sitting with your friends, laughing, drinking coffee from a tin cup. The next, a siren was blaring, and you were running for cover. There was no time to feel, no time to think about home. But now, as he sat beside his mother, as her wrinkled fingers traced the lines on his face, his heart began pulling him back to a time when life was simpler. Margaret seemed to feel it too. Her lips trembled as she looked at him, her thumb brushing over a small scar on his cheek. "You were always getting hurt as a kid." Nathan let out a quiet chuckle. "Yeah?" Margaret smiled, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. "You climbed that old apple tree in the backyard when you were 7. You slipped on a branch and hit your face on the way down." Nathan touched the scar absent-mindedly. "Dad was so mad." Margaret nodded, laughing softly. "But I wasn't. I told you to get up and try again, and you did." Nathan's chest tightened. He had forgotten about that, but as soon as she said it, the memory rushed back. The burning scrape on his face, the taste of tears, the way his mother had kneeled beside him, brushing dirt off his hands and saying, "Go on, Nathan, try again." Margaret's smile faded as she traced another scar, this one deeper, near his temple. Her voice was barely a whisper. "But this one wasn't from climbing trees, was it?" Nathan exhaled slowly. Rachel and Emily, still standing nearby, exchanged a glance. The room grew heavy with silence. Nathan shook his head. "No, Mom, it wasn't." Margaret's fingers lingered over the scar. She had imagined this moment so many times. She had spent years praying for him, picturing him safe, picturing him whole. But now that he was here, she realized something painful. The boy she had sent away was not the same man who had returned. Nathan lowered his gaze. "I saw things over there, Mom. Things I can't forget." Margaret squeezed his hands. "Then don't forget them, my boy. But don't let them define you either." Nathan swallowed hard. "Some nights, I wake up and I still feel like I'm there, like I never left." Margaret nodded slowly. "You're home now. It might take time, but you're home, and I'm here, always." Nathan let out a shaky breath. His mother had always been his anchor, and now, in the quiet of their little house, in the warmth of her embrace, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Safe. Rachel stepped forward cautiously, her voice hesitant. "Grandma, maybe we should give Nathan a little space. He just got home, and this is a lot." Margaret didn't take her eyes off her son. "He's had enough space. I think what he needs now is to remember." Nathan looked at her, surprised. Margaret smiled knowingly. "Remember what it feels like to be here, to be loved, to be yourself again." Rachel and Emily exchanged glances again. Then, without another word, Rachel disappeared into the hallway, returning with a worn shoebox. "We saved some things for you." Nathan furrowed his brows as she set the box on the coffee table. Margaret reached for it first, her fingers tracing the lid before she carefully lifted it. Inside, a lifetime waited for him. A toy soldier with a missing arm, his favorite childhood toy. A crumpled letter he had written to Santa when he was 9, asking not for toys, but for his father to come home safely. A photograph, a young Nathan, barely 18, in his military uniform, grinning proudly before boarding the bus that would take him to boot camp. Nathan stared at it all, his throat tightening. Margaret picked up the photograph, running her fingers over his younger face. "You were just a boy, but I knew, even then, that you had the heart of a man." Nathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I thought I was ready." Margaret's eyes softened. "And are you ready now?" Nathan looked up at her, something flickering in his gaze. For the first time in years, he didn't know the answer. Margaret reached for his hand once more, squeezing it gently. "Then we'll figure it out together." Nathan closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. The weight on his chest, the one he had carried for so long, felt just a little lighter, because for the first time since he left, he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The hardships of distance. The house had grown quiet. The initial wave of emotions had settled, leaving behind an almost fragile stillness. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, absently tracing the rim of a coffee cup. His mother sat across from him, her hands still resting near his, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. The shoebox of memories remained open on the table, its contents untouched since their last conversation. Margaret studied her son carefully. His shoulders were broader now, his hands rougher, but it wasn't just his body that had changed. There was a weight in his eyes, something heavy and distant. She had spent 3 years waiting for him to return, but now that he was here, she realized something heartbreaking. Parts of him were still somewhere else. Nathan cleared his throat. "Did you ever think I wasn't coming back?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "No." Nathan let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Everyone else did." Margaret sighed, glancing at the letters stacked neatly in the shoebox. "That's because they don't know how to wait the way a mother does." Nathan's fingers tightened around the cup. Margaret could see it, the way his body tensed, the way his jaw clenched. He was holding something back. "Nathan." He looked up, hesitant. She met his gaze. "Talk to me." Nathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't even know where to start." Margaret reached for the shoebox, pulling out a letter. The paper was worn, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if someone had held it too tightly, too often. She carefully unfolded it. "Start here." Nathan's eyes dropped to the letter, and immediately, his chest tightened. He knew that one. It was the letter he had sent her after his first year away, the one where he had tried to be strong, to sound brave. But between the carefully chosen words, between the lines that said, "I'm doing fine," and "Don't worry about me," there had been a different message, a silent one that said, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Margaret's voice was quiet when she spoke. "You were hurting." Nathan swallowed hard. "I didn't want you to know." Margaret gave him a sad smile. I knew anyway. Nathan looked down, his fingers tightening around the cup again. It was harder than I thought it would be. The waiting, the uncertainty. Margaret nodded, setting the letter down. You weren't the only one waiting. Nathan glanced up at her. What do you mean? Margaret sighed, rubbing her hands together as if warming them. Do you know how many times I sat by the phone, hoping to hear your voice? Nathan winced. Mom, how many nights I lay awake, wondering if you were warm, if you had eaten, if you were safe. Nathan ran a hand down his face. I didn't want you to worry. Margaret let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. Nathan, my job isn't to stop worrying. My job is to love you, even when you're far away. Nathan looked down at the letter again. For the longest time, he had thought his pain was his own, that no one else could understand the fear, the exhaustion, the loneliness. But now, sitting here, hearing his mother's words, he realized something. She had fought her own war, one of waiting, of hoping, of believing he would come home. And somehow, through it all, she had stayed strong. Nathan let out a shaky breath. How did you do it? Margaret smiled gently. I had faith, and I had you. Nathan swallowed the lump in his throat. I should have written more. I should have called more. Margaret shook her head. You did what you could, and you came home. That's all that matters now. Nathan exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, the guilt in his chest started to fade. Margaret reached for his hand again, squeezing it gently. You're home now, Nathan, and no matter how much time was lost, we have all the time in the world to make up for it. Nathan nodded, his grip tightening around hers. For the first time since he stepped off that plane, he felt something unfamiliar, hope, and for the first time in years, he believed it. The hero returns home. Nathan didn't sleep much that night. The house was quiet, so quiet that he could hear the creak of the old pipes, the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He lay in his childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness. For the past 3 years, silence had been dangerous. Out there, silence meant something was wrong. It meant an ambush, a missing patrol, the kind of tension that made your body stay rigid, made you grip your weapon a little tighter, made your breath come out slow and measured. But here, in this house, silence was safe. It was strange, almost unsettling. Nathan turned onto his side, eyes drifting to the window. Moonlight cast soft shadows on the floor. Everything in his room was exactly as he had left it. His high school football trophies, his books, the old flannel jacket hanging on the back of his desk chair. Everything was the same, but he wasn't. Nathan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. A part of him still felt like a visitor in his own home. Would that feeling ever go away? The next morning, the scent of fresh coffee and bacon filled the house. Nathan sat at the kitchen table while Margaret moved around the stove, humming softly. Rachel and Emily were already seated, pretending not to stare at him. Margaret set a plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, bacon, his favorite. Nathan hesitated for half a second before picking up his fork. Margaret sat down across from him with her own cup of coffee. You barely slept. Nathan smirked slightly. You always did know when I wasn't sleeping. Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. Mothers just know. Rachel leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. So, what's next for you, Nate? Nathan glanced at her. Rachel had always been blunt, never afraid to ask the hard questions. He appreciated it. Sometimes. Nathan stabbed a piece of bacon with his fork. I don't know yet. Emily frowned. Are you staying here? Nathan hesitated. That was the real question, wasn't it? Margaret remained quiet, watching him carefully. I don't know, he admitted. Rachel leaned back, crossing her arms. You don't have to figure it out right now. Nathan let out a breathy laugh. That's the problem. I feel like I should already know. Everyone else who came back seems to have a plan. They either go back to work or they go back to school. I feel like I'm supposed to have it all figured out. Margaret set her cup down gently. Nathan, you spent 3 years in a war zone. You don't have to rush into anything. Nathan shook his head. I just don't know how to be here yet. The room fell silent. Margaret reached across the table, resting a hand on his arm. Then take your time. We're not going anywhere. Nathan swallowed hard, nodding slightly. Emily gave him a small smile. You know, The whole town's been waiting for you to come home." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Rachel smirked. "You'll see." Nathan frowned but didn't press further. An hour later, Nathan found out exactly what she meant. He stepped outside, expecting a quiet morning. Instead, he was met with dozens of people standing in the driveway and along the street. Neighbors, old friends, teachers, the owner of the diner he used to eat at every Saturday, even Mr. Turner, the grumpy old man who used to yell at him and his friends for riding their bikes too fast down the road, and they were all waiting for him. A banner stretched across 2 wooden posts near the driveway. "Welcome home, Nathan." Nathan froze. Someone cheered, and just like that, the quiet morning exploded into life. People clapped, whistled, called his name. Nathan barely had time to react before Mrs. Hendricks, his old English teacher, pulled him into a crushing hug. "We're so proud of you, Nathan." Mr. Dawson, the mechanic, clapped him on the back. "Damn good to see you, kid." A wave of emotion hit Nathan hard. He had expected to feel out of place when he came back, expected to feel like a stranger in his own town. But standing here, surrounded by faces that had known him his entire life, hearing their voices, feeling their warmth, maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. Margaret stood on the porch, watching as person after person embraced her son, welcoming him home like he had never left. She smiled softly, wiping a tear from her cheek, because for the first time since he stepped through that door, Nathan finally looked like he believed it. He was home. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to stay. Tears and embraces. Nathan had never been good with big crowds. Even before the war, he wasn't the kind of guy who craved attention. But this was different. This wasn't just a crowd. This was home. Everywhere he turned, he saw familiar faces. People who had watched him grow up. People who had prayed for his safe return. "You've grown into quite the man, Nathan." Mrs. Patterson, his old next-door neighbor, wiped her eyes as she squeezed his arm. "We followed every update we could. Margaret never let us lose hope," Mr. Dawson added. Nathan glanced toward the porch, where his mother stood with Rachel and Emily. She had known about this. That much was obvious. Nathan swallowed past the lump in his throat and turned back to the crowd. I don't know what to say." Sheriff Reynolds, the same man who had once pulled Nathan over for speeding at 17, stepped forward with a firm handshake. "You don't have to say anything, son. We're just damn glad you're home." Nathan clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. But then, out of nowhere, Tommy Miller came barreling through the crowd. "Nate!" Nathan barely had time to react before Tommy tackled him into a hug, nearly knocking him off balance. "Jesus, Tommy!" Tommy pulled back, grinning wide. "You look like hell, man." Nathan laughed. An actual, real laugh. "Yeah, well, 3 years in the desert will do that to you." Tommy's grin faltered just a little. "We were worried." Nate thought maybe. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Nathan exhaled slowly. "I know." Tommy nodded before yanking him into another hug. Nathan let himself sink into it. He hadn't realized how much he needed this. To be here. To be held. To be real again. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice. Soft. Disbelieving. "Nathan." Nathan stiffened. He knew that voice. Slowly, he turned, and there she was. Claire. She looked exactly the same and yet somehow completely different. Her hair was longer, tied in a loose ponytail. Her green eyes, the ones he had memorized years ago, shimmered with unshed tears. Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Claire took a hesitant step forward. "It's really you." Nathan let out a breathy chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, it's me." For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. The last time he had seen Claire was the night before he left. They had sat on the hood of his truck, looking at the stars, pretending like everything was normal. She had told him to come back to her, and then he never did. Not the way she had wanted him to. Claire blinked rapidly, then suddenly threw her arms around him. Nathan froze for a fraction of a second before holding on to her like his life depended on it. The smell of her shampoo, the warmth of her skin. It was too much and not enough all at once. She pulled back, hands gripping his jacket. "You idiot." Nathan huffed out a laugh. "Good to see you too, Claire." Claire sniffed, smacking his arm. 3 years, Nathan. 3. You could have written more, called more. Nathan swallowed, guilt creeping in. I know. Claire shook her head, wiping at her face. But you're here. Her voice broke on the last word. Nathan's throat tightened. Yeah, I'm here. Margaret watched from the porch, her hands clasped together. She'd always known Claire meant something to her son. And by the way Nathan was looking at her now, he still did. The crowd around them was still buzzing with conversation. But for Nathan, the world had shrunk to this moment. To Claire, to his mother, waiting for him on the porch. To the town that had never forgotten him. Nathan inhaled deeply, the cool morning air filling his lungs. For the first time in years, he felt something settle inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Peace. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to stay. What comes next? The sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting a warm golden glow over the town. The crowd had begun to thin, people heading home after welcoming Nathan back with hugs, handshakes, and more than a few tears. But the weight of the day still pressed against his chest. Nathan sat on the porch steps, staring out at the quiet street. His hands were clasped together, elbows resting on his knees. Everything about this place should have felt familiar. The scent of freshly cut grass, the distant hum of crickets, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. And yet, he felt like a stranger. Margaret eased into the rocking chair beside him, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't speak at first, just watched him with that quiet, knowing gaze of hers. Then, it's a lot, isn't it? Nathan let out a slow breath. Yeah. Margaret rocked gently, the old chair creaking. You don't have to decide anything tonight, you know. Nathan ran a hand over his face. That's the problem. I feel like I should already have a plan. Everyone keeps asking what I'm gonna do now. If I'm staying, if I'm leaving, and I don't have an answer. Margaret smiled softly. Then don't answer. Nathan let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. You make it sound so simple. Because it is, my boy. Nathan frowned, glancing at her. Margaret met his gaze with a steady warmth. For the past 3 years, every decision you made was about survival, about the next mission, the next order. You didn't have time to stop and ask yourself what you wanted. But now you do. And that's not a bad thing, Nathan. It's a gift. Nathan swallowed hard, looking away. A gift. He hadn't thought of it like that. For so long, his life had been about doing what needed to be done. He had followed orders, stuck to routines, made decisions based on necessity, not desire. The idea of choosing something for himself, of building a life that wasn't dictated by war or duty, it scared the hell out of him. Margaret seemed to sense his hesitation. She reached over, squeezing his arm gently. Whatever you decide, you won't have to do it alone. You have a home here, Nathan. You always will. Nathan nodded slowly, but the question still lingered. Was this really where he belonged? Later that evening, Nathan found himself walking. He wasn't sure where he was going at first. His feet just carried him down the familiar roads, past the old diner, past the high school football field, past the houses of childhood friends who had long since moved away. And then, before he even realized it, he was standing in front of Claire's house. Her porch light was on. A soft glow spilled from the living room window. Nathan hesitated. He could still hear her voice from earlier, the way it had cracked when she said, "You're here." Before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped up to the door and knocked. A few seconds passed. Then, the door creaked open. Claire stood there in sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, her hair still damp from a shower. She blinked in surprise. "Nathan?" Nathan cleared his throat. "Hey." She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Nathan hesitated, but eventually stepped inside. The house smelled like lavender and something sweet. Cookies, maybe. Claire folded her arms, leaning against the counter. Couldn't sleep. Nathan shook his head. Claire nodded, as if she understood, and maybe she did. She had known him before everything changed, before war and distance and silence had come between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "You know, when you left, I thought about you every day." Nathan looked at her sharply, but she kept her gaze on the floor. "I used to check the news constantly, read every article, watched every report. I memorized the names of the soldiers who didn't make it, just in case. Nathan's stomach tightened. Claire exhaled, finally meeting his eyes. And when you stopped writing as much, when the calls became less frequent, I thought maybe you weren't coming back. At least, not really. Nathan's jaw clenched. Claire, I'm not mad. Nathan shut his mouth. Claire offered a small, sad smile. I don't know where we stand anymore. Nathan felt his heart hammering. The truth was, he didn't know either. So much time had passed. So many things had changed. But standing here, looking at her now, he felt something familiar, something that had never quite gone away. I don't know where we stand either, Claire, but I do know one thing. She raised an eyebrow. Nathan took a deep breath. I'm tired of running. Claire's expression softened. Then maybe it's time to stop. Nathan stared at her. For the first time since he came home, he felt like he wasn't drowning in uncertainty. Maybe he didn't have to figure it all out tonight. Maybe he just had to take it one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, staying was the first step. The strength of family love. The following days felt different. For the first time since stepping off that plane, Nathan wasn't constantly thinking about what came next. He wasn't trying to plan his next move or worrying about how he would adjust. Instead, he let himself be here. He helped Margaret in the garden, pulling weeds and listening as she told old stories about his childhood, the ones he had forgotten but she never had. He went to the diner with Tommy, sitting in their old booth, laughing over burgers and milkshakes like they were 17 again. And at night, when everything got quiet, when the weight of the past still threatened to creep in, he reminded himself he wasn't alone anymore. Not here, not now. One afternoon, Nathan stood on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee. The air was crisp, the autumn leaves just beginning to change color. Margaret stepped outside, holding a small wooden box in her hands. I have something for you. Nathan raised an eyebrow. What is it? Margaret sat beside him, setting the box on her lap. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface before carefully opening it. Inside was a collection of small objects, things that, at first glance, seemed ordinary. A pressed flower, a faded ribbon, a small, folded note. Nathan looked at her, confused. Mom? Margaret smiled softly. These are the things I held on to while you were gone. Nathan felt his throat tighten. Margaret picked up the pressed flower first, turning it over in her hands. Do you remember the day before you left? You picked this for me from the front yard. It was the last thing you gave me before you boarded that bus. Nathan stared at the fragile petals. He had forgotten. Margaret placed it back in the box and picked up the ribbon. This was from the candlelight vigil the town held for you and the other boys who left. I kept it in my Bible every night. Nathan swallowed hard. Margaret finally reached for the note, unfolding it gently. And this. She held it out to him. Nathan hesitated before taking it. It was a letter, one he had written to her before his first deployment. His own handwriting stared back at him. Mom, if you're reading this, it means I haven't come home yet. But I promise you, no matter how far I go, no matter what happens, I will always find my way back to you. Nathan's hands trembled. He had written this as a precaution, a just in case, something they had told the soldiers to do in case they didn't return. And yet, she had never read it until now. Why didn't you open it before? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret reached for his hand. Because I never believed I would need to. Nathan shut his eyes, his breath unsteady. He had spent years convincing himself that war had changed him, that he had lost too much to ever truly return. But the truth was, he had never been lost. Because through it all, no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much distance had separated them, his mother had never let him go. Nathan turned to her, his eyes glassy with emotion. I love you, Mom. Margaret's smile trembled as she reached up, cupping his face just like she had when he was a boy. I never stopped loving you, my son, and I never will. Nathan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, because now, finally, he knew the truth. He didn't need to figure everything out overnight. He didn't need to have all the answers, because as long as he had his family, his home, and the love that had waited for him all these years, he would always, always find his way.